Hey Swifties! Welcome to a brand new episode of Swiftie School, where together we walk Clownelia Street covering the latest news and Easter eggs from our fearless leader, Taylor Swift. I'm your host, Reagan Bailey, and it is enchanting to have you here. Now that we're out of the woods, let's get into today's episode.
It's another great day to be alive at the same time as Taylor Swift. Hello, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm so excited because we've been having a lot of fun special guests on the podcast recently, and today's is equally as exciting because I have a fun backstory for you guys as I'm introducing our guest today, which is Kyle, someone that I met really randomly and organically at a coffee shop here in Los Angeles called Dialogue Cafe. I thought Kyle was internet famous, and turns out he is far from it, but even more so, deep into the world of English and literature, which is a perfect tie to all things Taylor Swift and songwriting. So that's going to be our focus for today. But without further ado, I'm so excited to welcome you to the podcast. Hi, Kyle. How are you?
Reagan, hey, it's good to see you on the screen, and hello to all of your many fans. And yeah, I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited that you're here. I feel like it's so random that we met. I'm no stranger to talking to strangers. That's something I've been doing since I was a child, but I'm so glad that I randomly spoke to you because I feel like you have such an interesting background, and I'd love to just tell the audience who's listening a little bit more about yourself and things that you're interested in, and then also what you do for a living.
Yeah, it was very interesting. And fun fact, I love talking to random people too. So I did not think it was foreign at all. It was right up my alley. But as I'm sitting there reading, Zadie Smith's Swing Time, you're just like, who are you? And I'm like, dude, I just teach literature, which is really cool. But so I teach literature here in Los Angeles from the East Coast, but moved to LA 4 years ago and sort of like did a lot of my training is all in like literature. So like undergrad and graduate school. And really enjoy, the works of like Henry James and like James Baldwin and Toni Morrison and Flannery O'Connor. So those are some of my literary heroes. And so that's kind of my backstory, like really just teaching. I've been teaching for quite some time now, but thinking about songs and lyrics and verse, which is poetry, if it's not prose, it's poetry. And so that's kind of like, this is pretty awesome to think about how writers like Taylor Swift is able to be sort of categorized with the works of like Emily Dickinson, not saying as equally as, because Dickinson is great, but just the way that she does her stuff with that, her writing. So yeah.
Certainly. Well, I am so excited. I think it's even more fun that you are not super deep into the world of Taylor Swift, and Kyle transparently is not a Swiftie.
I was extremely afraid to do this and very trepidatious because I was like, oh no, I don't know Taylor Swift. I respect her craft and what she does, but I was like, oh, Reagan, are you sure? I don't know many of her songs.
I was sure because I actually think one of the fun parts about speaking to people who are non-Swifties is, I've been listening to her music for so long, so I'm so familiar with it, but hearing a fresh take and fresh perspective, I love consuming content online of, there's someone in particular, I think I told you he's a librarian, and he's probably in his 80s, and he's doing these first impressions of listening to her new album, The Tortured Poets Department. And he's like, wow, these are really cutting deep and really interesting lyrically. So that's why I thought it'd be even more fun since you're not super deep in this world. But not to fear, I did give Kyle a couple of songs to listen to, which we are going to discuss towards the end of the episode. But let's go ahead and get into the discussion of lyrics and songwriting just in general. I would love to know, as someone who's deep in this world, well, I guess before we even get into that, what are your preferences? What do you listen to music-wise? Any artists that you admire?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I am a huge James Taylor fan who is a friend in some way of Taylor Swift.
She was named after James Taylor.
I know, which is really funny, right? I love James Taylor. He's like an icon to me. I love his music. I love Mamas and the Papas. I'm such a sort of older music listener. People like Boyz II Men. I love Boyz II Men and just kind of older 90s stuff I think is like really good. Jason Mraz, Jack Johnson, Sam Cooke, Ella Fitzgerald. This is just welcoming you into like some of my like music tastes. Yeah.
I love that. I love a
Pretty
little Jack
eclectic.
Johnson on. Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. And that's our invisible string. So we talk a lot on this podcast about invisible string. That's a song title of Taylor's, but I feel like I always find these. I'm looking for in my relationships with people, what is our invisible string? What ties us together? And perhaps your love for James Taylor is our invisible string today, since Taylor was named after him, which is so funny.
Yeah, I know, which is so cool. James Taylor's the man. So even his lyrics, at one point I could just like, oh my gosh, like look at this, like let's look at his lyrics. But people like him and Kendrick Lamar, who I think is like just kind of on a similar level, like lyrically and poetic.
Yeah.
Like I think he's also brilliant. And I would go as far as to say as like Tupac Shakur. So those are like two, I would say, rappers that I really respect and admire, because I think that they like do kind of similarly what Taylor Swift does, but they do it.
Kendrick Lamar has a song with Taylor Swift.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah. He's respected highly.
Totally.
So Kendrick, if you hear this, you're the man. Yeah.
Yes. Shout out Kendrick and Taylor. I'm curious your thoughts, because one of the fun things we like to call it clowning while we're trying to decipher lyrics. We're being clowns, we're being silly. And when looking at lyrics and analyzing them, I think it's interesting because artists have to find a way to say so much by saying so little in a song that's, often under 3 minutes or around 3 minutes. How do you feel, especially since you listen to music from the 90s, how do you feel like songwriting has evolved? Do you think it's gone downhill, uphill? How has it evolved? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that songwriting in a way has evolved, particularly with like what females like Taylor Swift and Beyonce are able to kind of like enmesh in their lyrics in a way. And that is to say, like, they're able to kind of be a little more organic and raw in the language that they use and be a little more forthcoming. Whereas before, I feel like women particularly had to be very demure still, and they had to like subtly try to combat the things that were going on generationally or from a societal standpoint. But now, like, hearing some of their lyrics, like, I don't want to put the cart before the horse, but Taylor Swift like mentions like, if the sex is good in the song, the manuscript, so for her to even be able to like voice that at this point is pretty, I think that speaks to how the music industry and women, they kind of have a lot more agency, which is pretty cool.
We've talked recently about artists like Chappell Roan, Olivia Rodrigo, that have really started to pop off in the recent months and years. And I think for them, to your point, we're seeing it become even younger and younger women who are feeling more comfortable being vulnerable through their song lyrics. But it's a direct translation to, I think, what's going on in society, which is a really interesting call out. I want to make sure I'm asking this properly, so correct me if I'm wrong, but something people talk about a lot with songwriting is the use of literary devices. Is that what I would call it?
Yeah.
Okay, so literary devices, when looking at songwriting, how can they be used to sort of enhance, I guess, the emotional impact of a song?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm thinking about like Emily Dickinson, for example. Like she has like her famous poem, I Dwell in Possibility, which is a great poem because what she's essentially doing is saying like the verse, the like understanding poetry, like she's building a poem through like the metaphor of a house, which is really, really great. And I think what that does is ultimately for the sort of like emotional impact, the poetry allows like for a more concentrated expression of emotions and ideas, which I think Emily Dickinson would really be pleased with Taylor Swift's sort of lyrics because she's able to sort of capture like the fleeting moments and things like that. And I think that like Swift's use of rhyme and Swift's use of like imagery in a way, I think it does what poetry is supposed to do in a way.
That's an interesting call out that you said about the metaphor of building a house because, we know that Taylor has an interest in obviously the music world, but poetry as well. And when you said the house, it kind of sparked this thought for me because Taylor often she calls it the lover house. And basically she
Unit.
compartmentalizes in each room of the house a different era of her life, which is tied to her different albums. So I wonder how much inspiration she's drawn from people like, Emily or, her predecessors. So that's an interesting call out. But it made me think of music videos when you're talking about imagery. How imperative do you feel like music videos are for bringing lyrics and songwriting to life, or are they not at all?
Well, first of all, you are a Swiftie savant, if I could just use that form of alliteration to describe you, Reagan.
I
Like
like
just
that.
knowing, just knowing your insights into that, how she thought about a house and things like that. When it comes to videos and lyrics, I think I have seen, for example, my sister was obsessed with the song The Man by Taylor Swift. And so I've seen like that video, which I think is really cool, the way that she actually revamped that to make herself, right? This idea of like kind of like passing in a way, right? She's kind of
Yeah.
like passing as a man in that video, which elevates the video and the lyrics even more because she's displaying, the toxicity and toxic masculinity in a way, and just kind of doing things that are, sadly stereotypic of a man, back in the day, really. Hopefully, I think we've changed a lot. So I think that video in and of itself, to your question, I think ultimately does a nice job. And I think she's methodical in how she was possibly going to shoot this video and what she wanted it to convey and how to dovetail it nicely with the lyrics. So I think a lot of thought goes into the video element of it as well.
I'm curious for artists like her, the intentionality behind choosing what song to pair a music video with, because in my mind, I feel like when an artist puts out a music video for a song, it almost takes away the creative element for a listener, because now you have direct imagery tied to it. You're no longer guessing what the meaning is. You're no longer trying to decipher. You now have assigned meaning. And so it's kind of, I feel like it puts a lot of weight onto the artist for what song they choose to depict and how they're going to depict it. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And I think the beauty of like literature and language and poetry, right, is that the speaker allows us, the reader, to kind of like do our own excavation and to kind of distill the lyrics in a way to make sure, or to think about presumably how we've arrived at something that maybe they perhaps have not actually even thought about. And so I think it's very important. And I think, writers are often very intentional about which songs they're actually going to record, like for a video, because it does, to your point, it detracts from what we, the listeners, we, the readers, are able to kind of like build our own image and build our own metaphors and understand certain things that they're using to convey the message that they're sort of hinting at. So I would agree. Yeah.
That's interesting. I haven't thought of that until now, which I think a lot of people are often excited for music videos and then disappointed when their favorite song isn't depicted. But I almost wonder if artists intentionally want to stay away from certain songs that have so much popularity because it would take away that excitement from someone who's trying to assign their own like emotion or tone or mood or to the song.
Absolutely.
I'm curious in songwriting in general, generally speaking, and of course we can tie it to Taylor as well, but are there any literary techniques that are typically applied to songwriting?
Oh my gosh, endless techniques. I think the fact that like, prose, if it's not poetry, it's prose, right? And so poetry, because it is verse, just with like Dickinson's I Dwell in Possibility, there are rules that can be broken within verse and poetry that cannot be broken in prose. And so the poetry's form allows for this like concise writing. It allows for like rhyme, in rhyme, and slant rhyme, and allows for like, alliteration. And a lot of poetry also, and lyrics, I would argue with, musical lyrics, I would argue would be a lot of it's like, it's an allegory of some sort, right? They're sort of using this song that is compacted in no more than, 5 minutes or something to actually draw a narrative and to speak to something that seems to be, whether it's a political or moral issue, to really evoke that within us as the listeners and to give us that sort of impression of the imagery and the alliteration that they're using and the hyperbole and the metaphor and the personification, all of those terms that we can rattle off. I think poetry and verse ultimately allows for the writer to do that, just as a poem does. The speaker does that. Yeah.
I love that. I think, well, something I would love for you to expand upon. We have a wide range of ages that listen to this podcast. Can you explain the difference between poetry and prose?
Yes, absolutely. So for the kids out there, for all the youngin', so
Yes.
prose is just written form of, whether it's a letter or a book that you're reading. So if it's not prose, then it's poetry, and which AKA also known as verse, which means that allows you to sort of like break certain conventions that you cannot break in prose. Whereas like in poetry, you can, your line, you don't have to end the line with a period or any punctuation. You can be extremely intentional. But with prose, right, you have to have a subject and a verb. You have to have that in order for it to be a independent clause and a dependent clause and what those are. But in poetry, AKA verse, we don't have to worry about those things. There's so many rules that we can break. And that's the unconventionality of verse and poetry and lyrics for like Taylor Swift and other writers like Kendrick and things like that. Like they're able to sort of break certain norms and kind of go against what prose would tie them down to. That's kind of it, really.
I love that. And this is so on theme. I don't know how I didn't think of this, having this conversation sooner with her most recent album being titled Tortured Poets Department. I'm so curious what her interest is and if there are any poets that she looks up to. Are there any poets, I know you've mentioned a couple that really stand out to you that you would encourage listeners to explore after this?
Oh my gosh, Lyd, yes. I would definitely say like Jean Toomer or, Wordsworth or Percy Bysshe Shelley or, those are the romantics. If we're coming to America, I would see like Gwendolyn Brooks. And I would say, there's so many, like Langston Hughes, like there are just so many. I'm an Americanist when it comes to like that's my training, my background. So a lot of my writers are like American. But to name a few, I would suggest, right? I think that Mary Shelley, right, who was the wife of Percy Bysshe Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, like I think she would ultimately sort of like widely argue that poetry, in a sense, is like has the capacity to sort of inspire and change. And I think, thinking about Taylor Swift in this way and her lyrics that she's sort of like, she evokes and she sort of pins, I think she's ultimately trying to do the same thing in a way.
Yeah. Would you say that that's pretty uncommon these days? Or do you think it's done subtly by other artists and more forward by Taylor Swift? Or how common is that?
Yeah, I feel like for quite some time, I think we have like pockets or two buckets of like sort of artists, right? We have like, and I know this is Swiftie School, and so I daren't, step on, but we have like, right, like, Kendrick Lamar, like I said, who's a lyricist, and like somebody like Tupac Shakur. But then if you have somebody who is like, I don't know, they're really sort of rapping about things that are social change and things like that. And I would argue probably, and I'm also not a Beyonce either, but I would probably say that I think she does things like that too. But then you have like a cohort of rappers and singers who aren't really trying to do that, who are probably just using their pen to make money in a way. But I think that's kind of why I salute somebody like Taylor Swift and Kendrick for what they do with their lyrics to kind of really activate change and social change in a society. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting how, there's been so much talk and focus on Taylor's career really exploding over the past few years. And I've wondered, as a lifelong fan, we've talked often on the podcast, what is the moment? What is the thing that's really been explosive? And I think the fact that she has people continuing to talk about her music months after it releases, years after it comes back out. And I think I attest a lot of that to the fact that her lyrics are so deep and interesting. And I gave you a couple songs to listen to. I know you mentioned The Man earlier, but a lot of listeners, I had asked them what song they would ask you to listen to, and they said The Manuscript. So you had a chance to listen to The Manuscript along with So Long London. Let's start with The Manuscript. This is the last song, song 31 on a 2.5-hour album from Tortilla
Oh my
Department.
gosh.
It is a deep cutting song to say the least. What are your first impressions? Did anything stand out to you? Literary devices? Tell me everything.
Oh my gosh. Honestly, like as somebody who does appreciate music, good music, I would add, and good singing, I think that that song, the way that it comes on, it's just like, it's really beautiful in a way. I like the title of the song. And so my impression of it was like when I was listening to it, like, okay, what is Swift doing here with the title of the manuscript? And we know that like a manuscript is something that's very long. And I think what she's doing with that is the storytelling of it, right? And how these two individuals come together and they meet. And then, you know, she mentions a lot of like imagery and symbolism of like kid cereal and the stroller. And so thinking about sort of, she's ultimately like grounding, I would say, these sort of abstract feelings that we are able to sort of like share and from a relatable experience, that people who are getting together with somebody are thinking about how they can build and construct a family in a way and what's coming down the pipe, right? And so kids cereal and strollers and pushing those strollers and the French press coffee. And so it's this sort of trajectory, and the narrative kind of really goes from 0 to 100, or the start to finish, that inception of a relationship, and then the culmination of that, and that is like the marriage, and then the children that come. And so that was like my initial impression of it. I hope that does like answer your question, Reagan.
It does. I think this song, to me, I love that analysis of it. I love hearing people's first impressions, especially if they haven't listened to some of Taylor's songs, especially ones like this goes so against the stereotype of like pop music. And it's not something, this isn't a song you hear on the radio, you know, but that's often what someone like Taylor Swift is associated with. But I think this song in particular, and I would love your take on this. It's interesting how it starts out. Now and then she rereads the manuscript, almost talking from like a bird's eye view, telling the story of someone else. Like she reads the manuscript. But then the final line of the song, where she then now is talking in first person, saying the story isn't mine anymore. And so it's interesting because it starts out by this, almost like she's telling it from, you know, the future, talking about her past, but then now she's back in present. And the shift of that, did you notice that throughout the song as well? Or is there what would you define that as?
I did notice that shift, actually. And I think that I would probably define that as like the narrative structure in which the song recalls a story about like this affair, this introspection in a way, and then the growth, this sort of development. Yep. And so I think that's what poetry ultimately focuses on too, like focuses on like the character development. I think that song, in a sense, it is a great example of storytelling, and how storytelling can also be seen within poetry, because more often than not, poetry is sort of looked at, you know, students and people quibble about it because they're like, there are no characters and there's no start and end and blah, 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 blah.
Right.
But I think I would argue that something, or lyrics like Swift's lyrics, ultimately she's doing that and showing you that there is a trajectory, there is this arc, right? There is this sort of like the acceleration will come. And it comes in that song in the middle, and I don't know it and can't recite it as eloquently as you, but I remember one line that stuck out to me, or a few, like, but one of them in particular is like this idea of like, you know, she says like, you're not an organ donor, the license or something like that. I'm probably butchering it, but that is like really great, because then she uses that and talks about you're not an organ donor, but I think she says like, the guy says you can have my heart, which is right, which is love. And so, which is such a great way to spin and to play with like, you know, literary devices in a sense, right? She's playing with that, replacing that sort of anaphora in a way, like replacing that, like, I'm not an organ donor, but you can have my heart. And so that was like a beautiful line, and it was well written.
Yeah.
The way she like did that. That
she does that often.
That turn of phrase is like, it's amazing how she did that. It was really, really great.
That's one of my favorite things that she does in her songs. They always give me chills when you have those flip moments.
Yeah.
It's really cool. I'm so glad you called that out, because that's something I noticed in that song.
Yes.
You're a Swiftie. So Another song we talked about was So Long London. This is one of her most beloved songs for many reasons, but I'm curious, this was your first time listening to the song. It's a hard-hitting song, but you had mentioned something to me before we started recording about kind of how she replaces London, a place, but we all know and can decipher that she's actually talking about a person. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like that is another, because when you, right. And then the comma there, right? Like so long,
Mm-hmm.
comma, London, just right from the bat, one is thinking like, okay, she's talking about London because she's also I think she mentions like a heath, the line, like the word
Yes.
heath, which is really known and common in Britain. Like it is like, it is like a staple. It is like shrubbery that is kind of like devoid in a sense. And so she mentions even using that word is intentional with like, okay, yes, I'm writing about a person who is being personified through London in a way, or sort of not so much, yes, being personified through London in a way, but also I'm going to sort of like employ certain words and phrases that are common with like England and common with like London to kind of really heighten and elevate that. And I think that is what adds the sort of like emotional depth in a way. And somebody like William Blake, who's famous for like, he was an 18th century sort of poet, right? Tiger, Tiger, Song of Innocence. I think he would appreciate Swift's like imagery in a way and thinking about her vivid imagery and how it sort of like resonates with her listeners, right? Because she's evoking a lot of language in a sense in the imagery that she's using. So somebody like William Blake would probably enjoy Taylor Swift and be pleased that she's talking about England in a way too. I gave you
Totally.
I gave you a very like
I love
infatuous
this
answer, but yeah.
I know, I love that. I think there's certain hard hitters in this song that are so image rich, like even the 4 words, 2 graves, 1 gun. I can
That's a great line. That's a
write
great
yeah.
that's a great line. I really was like, oh, this is good. I definitely
Yeah.
I like that a lot.
Because
Yeah.
4 words and I know exactly what she means. It's like 2 broken hearts, this relationship's dead, casualties have gone, but there was only 1 gun, 1 person associated. And it's like I could talk for 30 minutes just about those 4 words, and that's really what I find interesting about this song and why I think it's so beloved is the way she does that.
Mhm.
There's one line in particular that I love. You say I abandoned the ship, but I was going down with it. And I loved that, the image that goes along with those lyrics of she was committed to this relationship regardless. She's going to go down with this ship even though she was accused of abandoning it. And it's like that storytelling there is so interesting. So I'm glad you had a chance to listen to that one because wow, I feel like we could do a whole episode just on that song.
You really could. And I think like to your point about, I think the next line, something about her hand gripping it. Am I correct?
Mm-hmm. Her white knuckle dying grip.
Her white knuckle
holding
dying grip.
Mm-hmm.
Holding tight. Okay. So again, as somebody who doesn't know her music that well, but listening to that, even just thinking about, right, she's saying holding a ship, which is impossible. And so it's very hyperbolic, right? So she's already using hyperbole in a sense to say that, like, as if her white hand, or however she's saying it, could possibly avoid the ship from capsizing. And so even the use of that, saying like a hand, and then I think it goes back to, let's like add gender to it, that a woman's hand, like, which is typically, I am all for women. I am women's rights. I totally get it. I'm not saying that women are weak or anything. But my point that I'm saying is like, just like physically in terms of like her strength, and saying like my hand is sort of trying to, now it's going down because it could not hold this up anymore. And so as if a woman's hand could prevent it. I mean, a man's hand can't prevent. I can't hold a ship. I can't. But
I love that. And then the way it immediately shifts we go from the ship to the white knuckle, the dying grip, even using the word dying after she said the graves and the gun. We've already had this theme of the dying, but then she switches it again from her grip on, the relationship in the ship to then holding tight to your quiet resentment, something that can't be tangibly held, resentment. And so that shift of how she ping pongs back and forth is so unique and interesting. I love that song for that reason, but it feels like this whiplash is what makes it so fun to listen to and specifically to decipher in that song.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think to your point, finally, like the use of the pronoun your when she says like your resentment, like that is really, that second person pronoun really does something in a sense of like really making sure that the reason why this has happened is like because of you and you are the one. And so when we as readers and listeners listen to it too, writers often have, especially in poetry, right? They're often using second person pronoun, which does something to the listener or the reader because they're putting the reader or the listener into that situation to allow us to actually to become like conduits of like what is happening right now. So you're like, wait a minute,
Right.
When she says your resentment, you're like, wait, I don't have resentment, and sort of really putting us in that situation because of that second person pronoun. And pronouns often do that work brilliantly. And I think she's doing such a great job with it too.
It's so funny you bring that up because in a lot of my work of making content for social media, a large part of it is strategically thinking, the first 3 to 5 seconds of a video that I put out, I really have to do something grand to draw someone's attention before they swipe away. And one of the techniques that I use that works so well is using the word you or your in the first 3 to 5 seconds, because what I've found is when someone hears you or your in the first couple seconds of my video, it immediately makes them interested in, because now it's about them. It's no longer about me. So, as simple as saying, if you've ever experienced your lipstick wiping off, keep watching this video. And immediately it's like, instead of me saying, I'm going to show you a lipstick that doesn't wipe off, by just adding that little switch of putting the word you adds so much more interest and typically garners a lot more viewership. So it's interesting when you mention that in songwriting. I've never thought of the same thing of how emotion can be impacted just by using that simple shift in words.
Absolutely. Like shameless plug here. I think, somebody who has my other poet, like Claudia Rankine, who is a beast and she's brilliant. She's a contemporary poet. And so we think about contemporary poets and those poets of the past. And like, she does that so beautifully. And, Toni Morrison once said, like, I like to invite the reader into the experience. I want them to come to the table. And so it is intentional. There's intentionality in doing that. And so even you sort of pointing that out, like kind of also allows us to be a part of like, has your lipstick, blah, blah, blah. So yeah.
Right. It's such an interesting concept when you think of someone who is this A-lister status like Taylor Swift, who probably experiences immense isolation, loneliness. I wonder if inviting people into her lyrics helps aid in those feelings, like feeling less alone if she knows there's like a relatability aspect to the artwork that she's putting out. I wonder if subconsciously a lot of artists are doing that when writing lyrics or songwriting. I would be curious. Maybe a psychologist needs to come on and help break that down.
I think that you can go with your hypothesis and think that they are actually thinking similarly to the way that we are. They are human after all. And so Taylor Swift does not leave a stone unturned, when it comes to talking about her history of relationships and things like that and talking about change. And so, so I think so.
Well, I am on the edge of my seat, as are many Swifties, for Taylor's next move, because we are expecting a new album in the works coming soon. And I would be really curious when that does happen to have you perhaps come back on and help analyze and break down some of the lyrics, as it'll be new to all of us, so we could decipher together. But this was incredibly fun. And I love sort of taking this spin and angle on lyricism and songwriting. So I'm so grateful that you were able to join me today.
Oh my gosh, I'm so honored, Reagan. I hope you are clearly doing the Swifties proud right now. But thank you so much for having me on, inviting me on, and just how serendipitous that was, and that we bumped into each other. And I was so happy to be on your podcast and to bring the little information that I have to help.
Totally. I believe in those serendipitous moments. I wasn't even planning on going to the coffee shop. I typically don't sit in that spot when I go there. So I think it was meant to be. And I definitely hope to stay in contact and really appreciate you being here. People might throw in some comments, ask some questions. So if that's the case, maybe we'll have to do a follow-up. But until then, I'm so grateful for your time. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Reagan. Bye, y'all.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. I know all too well how busy life can be, and I am so grateful that you chose to stay. Now just know this is me trying, and I would greatly appreciate if you took a minute to leave a review or maybe share this episode with a fellow Swiftie. Make sure you join my broadcast channel on Instagram for more Swiftivities, and long story short, this love is real, and I'm beyond grateful for your support. See you next time.